Bo, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Bo, perhaps you can start off by how did you get into logical fallacies? I'm a truth seeker. I'm interested in finding out truth, and logical fallacies are a key component there. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about how you got interested to write your book, Logically Fallacious.
Sure, yeah, you bet. It started with debate, actually. I was exploring my religion, the religion I was born into, which was Catholicism. At the time, this was about 10 or 15 years ago. And I was starting to question a lot of things, obviously. And so I decided to create a website called debategod.org. And it was just basically a forum, like an online forum, a discussion board. But it became really popular because I also had a podcast of the same name where I gathered hundreds of the top debates between Christians and atheists. And I would gather those into a podcast feed, and then I would, of course, reference the website for people to come over and debate and discuss. So that's what happened, and it became a very popular site. And I started to just to kind of like lose my mind in a little bit. This is when I was introduced to this world where people could basically say anything. And it sounds good. It sounds like, yeah, that makes sense. But there was something wrong with what they were saying. There was something about it that just didn't make sense. And upon closer inspection, when you really think about it, you realize that, hey, there's a mistake in their reasoning. There's something going on here that's not right. So it's very deceptive in a way. And it doesn't mean that they're trying to be deceptive. This is how people think. This is how people reason. There are these what we call logical fallacies or cognitive biases, which is kind of the foundation of a lot of logical fallacies. And they were using these things, let's call them. I didn't know the name at the time. And then I began to do a little research, and I found out that there were something called logical fallacies, which were basically errors in reasoning, not errors in facts, but in the way that they interpret the facts or the way that they are explaining an argument. And then I went back, I read a lot of the previous debate posts, and from that point on, I was just like hooked. I said, I cannot believe these errors of reasoning are so common, and I missed them for so long. So I really developed a fascination for them, and what I started to do is collect them and compile them, and then do research on the beginnings of them, like when they started, who came up with it at first. And I just put it all together in a book. And that book went over, I think it's in it's 6th revision now, and I'm going to be revising it again this year. I had an academic edition that came out for the first time about 3 years ago. It's just been growing ever since. So that's how I got involved in logical fallacies.
I think they're a very important tool for us to know about, aren't they? If we are to spot these errors, as you say, and it's interesting that you point out that that they obviously can be accidental. Probably a lot of the time, people we know and bump into probably use them accidentally, but they also have this potential to be, to be sort of deliberate, haven't they? I mean, you can really mislead people, you could, using these various fallacious arguments. The book is in quite an incredible collection, isn't it? Over 300 or so. You've probably got more now, I imagine. But maybe you can explain a little bit about they essentially fall into two categories, don't they? The sort of kinds of logical fallacies. Just to sort of get this one out of the way, they're considered as popular beliefs that are false or actually bad arguments. Can you explain how they have these sort of two definitions?
Well, if I had to put logical fallacies in categories, and I try to avoid doing that in the book, at least a lot of the smaller, more fine-tuned categories, because there's so much overlap that it's really, there's no clear delineation between one fallacy and another. But if there is like two distinct categories, one would be like deductive or inductive logical fallacies, formal or informal. The language goes both ways. Basically, what we're talking about when you're talking about a deductive or a formal fallacy, it's the typical, like the Socrates is a man, that told, like, if then this. There are, like, you could walk through the steps and you're guaranteed to come to the right conclusion if you follow the formula. But if there's a fallacy in there, then something's going to be wrong. So it's basically working with syllogisms, whereas informal fallacies are more arguments in themselves, I like to call them, where you could say, hey, that's begging the question, and you could argue. You could say, well, I don't think that's begging the question, or no, I don't think that's a straw man.
Okay.
I don't think that's magical thinking. I mean, you can argue that, and there always is this spectrum of truth, if you want to call it that. I mean, some things are clearly, obviously fallacious when it comes to informal logical fallacies, whereas other things could be argued and say, well, maybe that's fallacious, or there's an element of a fallacy to it, but it doesn't have to be.
Okay,
And,
maybe can I just interject there?
Yeah,
What
sure.
category would a sort of a common logical fallacy, such as the appeal to majority, or everyone believes it, so if everybody believes this is true, how come you don't? I mean, that isn't even a rational argument at all. But would that come under the informal category?
Yes, actually, that would be an informal logical fallacy. And you could see some extremes on that. Like, you can just say, everybody believes that, I don't know, and you could say anything. Let's say like a religion. You could say there's over almost 2 billion Muslims in the world that believe that Muhammad flew on a winged horse. So clearly that happened. And so you could see the reasoning with that. It's just because a lot of people believe it, it doesn't mean that it happened. But there's also something to, like, the popularity with belief that adds a sense of credibility to the belief itself. One of the points that I like to bring up sometime that I still find kind of strange in my field, in psychology. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but I do also study clinical psychology, with disorders, mental disorders. There's a book called the DSM, which is basically kind of like the Bible of all the mental health issues, the mental disorders. Mm-hmm. On many of these disorders, there are exceptions for religious belief. So, for example, like paranoia, schizophrenia, or things like that, it will say, unless you're having delusions of God or something, then it's not a disorder. So this is essentially an appeal to religion, an appeal to popularity, because so many people believe in these things. So many people will drop on their knees in church and like start convulsing, but that's not a problem, at least in the eyes of the majority, or in the eyes of the people who put together this book, the many different psychologists, because it's such a popular belief.
Yeah.
So it's you could see how you could say, okay, well, it doesn't make it any more true, that's for sure. No. But it makes it more acceptable in a way.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of argument and debate around informal logical fallacies.
Yeah, it's incredible that you mentioned this appeal to religion, because I think it was Nathaniel Brandon who said that he was comparing mysticism, belief in God. Broadly speaking, that's mysticism. He was comparing that with schizophrenia, and and he was explaining that I mean, I won't go into it, but it's the analogy was very accurate. The fact that a schizophrenic will accept his own delusions as real and reject reality, and yet you could argue that that's what a mystic does, who believes in God. So yes, it's fantastic. It's fascinating, to see the various ways that truth can be sort of slipped into or truth, I should say, inverted commas, can be slipped into people's minds without any rational basis. Can I ask you? I assume now that you're an atheist, are you?
Yes.
Can you share with us how you define truth? Because you start off your book, I think in the preface, you say there are those that say that we're living in the post-truth world. What a shocking notion that is, the idea that truth no longer matters. So how do you define truth?
Oh boy, that's a tough philosophical question. I think for the purpose of the book, I try to just focus on things that are objectively and demonstrably, I want to say the word true, but that's using the word in the definition, that is the case, something that is demonstrably the case.
Yeah.
So that, and here's the crazy thing. It's like you can argue against anything. And you even hear people saying, well, 1 + 1 isn't necessarily two if like these certain conditions are, so it gets crazy. But I think for the vast majority of people and the vast majority of situations, it's pretty clear if something is the case or not.
Yeah.
And then there's a lot. So there's the whole discussion of objectivity versus subjectivity. Like what's true to you isn't necessarily true to me, and that's fine when we're talking about preferences. I unnecessarily, but I do love, let's say, peanut butter cups. And then that might not be the case for you, but it could be like true for me. But we're not talking about like an objective fact of reality, objective fact of the universe. We're talking about a preference. So there's a lot of that has to be mixed into the discussion when you're talking about truth. I don't know if that answered your question, but I guess if we're talking about the truth, what demonstrably is the case?
Sure. I mean, I tend to think of truth as that which corresponds with reality. And of course you've got things like degrees of certainty that come into that. So let's maybe look a little bit into perhaps we should give a few examples first of common informal logical fallacies. I have mentioned the appeal to consensus, if you like, the appeal to the majority, just to sort of give people an idea to concretize these. There's also the appeal to authority, isn't there? Because some doctor's wearing a coat and he's got a stethoscope around his neck, you might tend to believe everything he says, in the sphere of medicine, but it doesn't necessarily, mean that he's speaking the truth. Can you give us some ideas, some examples off the top of your head, and particularly maybe a couple of examples of the formal ones as well, and then maybe we'll dive into the history of it a bit.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I do want to bring up or talk a little bit about the appeal to authority, the one that you mentioned, because that is a fascinating one and one that is constantly being debated, and for good reason. And I like to draw the distinction, like when it is fallacious versus when it's not really fallacious. So, for example, if climate change is a big example of this. People can point to, let's say, people who accept climate change that haven't actually gone out and done all the research themselves. And they could say, well, you're just appealing to authority. All of these scientific organizations and the top scientists and the 90 whatever percent, the vast majority of all these places say that climate change is real and it's a problem and it's humans have something to do with it, a big part of it. And you're just accepting that. Therefore, you're just appealing to authority. And that's not actually the case. When you're looking at, let's say, what you're actually doing is you're if you want to call it appealing to, but you're taking scientific consensus. You're taking the scientific method that has been proven in the past to provide the best possible results and the most accurate conclusions, the closest we could possibly get to truth, and you're accepting that based on the professional and the expertise of other people, the professional views and the expertise of the other people. Whereas appealing to authority, like the example that you've given, like just because, let's say, a doctor says it's okay to smoke Marlboro once a week because I'm a doctor, and well, he's a doctor, so he must be right. That's kind of more of a classic case of appealing to authority. There's a lot of problems with that. First, that that doctor is probably not necessarily an authority on lung cancer and on smoking, and he's just wearing a lab coat. So there's if there's no direct connection between expertise and what that person is saying, then there's a problem. Okay. If there is, and you're simply just referring to somebody, that could be a problem. Like if you're simply saying, well, Stephen Hawking believes in this and he's an incredibly bright guy, therefore I believe in it. That's problematic in a way, even though that you're probably right if you take his opinion on astrophysics or something where he's an expert. But it's still not necessarily good reasoning if you're just accepting somebody else's view. So I think that's a perfect example of how you can take a fallacy, and on one end it could not be fallacious, on the other it could be extremely fallacious, depending on a lot of different variables and factors.
Okay, just to clear up for anybody who doesn't understand, when you say appeal to, do you mean that the person making the argument is trying to persuade you, so he's appealing, so the person presenting the argument is trying to get the listener, he's appealing to get the listener to listen to, or is it the person that's sort of the recipient of the argument? Are they appealing to the which
that's
way
what
around
it's generally understood to be, right? So the recipient of the argument is appealing to this idea. They're appealing
in order to justify
right.
the belief,
in order to justify their argument or their belief. Right?
Okay,
that's usually what the appeal refers to.
Yeah.
So ad hominem is another common one, extremely common. If you say, let's say there's somebody making a very lucid, valid argument, and you look at them and say, yeah, well, they're an ass, so therefore they're wrong. It perfectly may be the case that they are an ass, but that has no effect whatsoever on the argument that they're making. Yeah. Once again, we could get into the fine points where, let's say somebody, ad hominem circumstantial is a variation of the ad hominem, where they have, where somebody making an argument has strong motivation to say something that isn't true. I hate to come down on car salespeople, used car sales, but let's just say that you're at a used car lot. You're looking to buy a used car, and the car salesman will say, this is a fantastic automobile, and people tell me that it runs great, and therefore I think you should buy it. The car salesperson is essentially making an argument, and one could say, well, clearly they have an interest in selling me the car. Therefore, I should not believe what they're saying. Now, that is perfectly valid. Because somebody is motivated, you have to take these ideas into consideration. But somebody also could come to you and say, well, that's an ad hominem circumstantial. Just because they have a motivation for doing something doesn't mean they're lying. And they're correct as well.
Sure.
The difference is whether you're claiming that they are demonstrably, objectively false in what they're saying, or you're just saying, I should add an extra layer of skepticism to what they're saying because of their intentions.
Sure. I think sorry to speak over you there. It's kind of context specific, isn't it? It depends on the context in which you're hearing the argument and the person's making it. You could argue that the car salesman wants to preserve his reputation, and he really gets his facts right. But I take your point, and also on there's this ideal with the idea with appeal to authority. Just to rewind back to where you were a moment ago. Appealing to authority is quite valid in some circumstances, isn't it? Like, when we take your car to the garage or something, and we all sort of delegate to somebody with higher knowledge. But there does become a point where you have to sort of satisfy yourself that your sources are correct as well, don't you? And it's interesting that you refer to the climate change debate. It's a very, very useful example here, because there are clearly two sides to the argument, and one thing that fascinates me is that whenever you hear the sort of mainstream narrative, if you like, the mainstream official version that CO2 is a problem, I've noticed that I very rarely hear an argument. I only ever hear that 97% allegedly of the world's scientists think, and you hear various phrases like that, but you don't actually hear any real reasons. But then if you take the time to look at the counter argument and visit and seek out these people that are saying the opposite, you find that they are actually making arguments. They're making rationally constructive arguments. So there, in terms of this appeal to authority, it seems that it is a bit of a sticky one, isn't it? It can suck people in, whereas they need to sort of zoom out a little bit, don't you, and sort of check out all sides of the story.
Sure. Yeah. Well, climate change is I hate to say it, but it is still kind of not debatable. What's the word I'm looking for? Well, let's just say it's debatable in a sense that there's not a lot of agreement on. There's a lot of people arguing. Controversial. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah.
But if we take something like flat Earth, that's another great example, because you could use the same techniques, and you could see that when people who are for the flat Earth, trying to argue for a flat Earth, they need to present. They can't appeal to authority because they don't have it on their side. Clearly, the round earthers, the spherical earthers, have the authority and the expertise and everything on their side. It's something, when something is so obvious or so clear, there's so much research on. If you ever tried arguing with a flat earther, they'll present you with like tons of facts, again in quotes, and information, and you probably don't know how to respond to that. I mean, you've never looked it up. It's something you've taken for granted, because again, it's kind of like it's a known fact, right? So you don't have all the research to support that fact. So the best you really can do is just say, look, okay, until you convince NASA or some other organization that has actually been in space and circled the globe, and until you convince them that your flat Earth theory is true, then leave me alone. I'm going to stick with the spherical Earth, and then convince them first, and then they'll convince me. But I don't want to hear it from you. So you could see how that can be taken as an appeal to authority, but it's perfectly logical and perfectly rational, and given what we know about science and establishing facts and how it works, you are far more likely to be right by taking that approach than you are to be wrong.
Truth can be found, and people need to sort of, I think, avail themselves to the raw data of the argument themselves, don't they? And this is why I think awareness of logical fallacies is so important, to see, now, why is it I believe this? Why do I think this is true? And then, if you're answering your own question, as it were, you say, well, so and so said it, or everybody else believes it, or NASA believe it, and right. But I think ultimately it's kind of the raw data that really makes the argument. Would you agree with that, or do you think that we always have to sort of delegate out a certain amount?
Well, it depends what the raw data is. And it depends on what that raw data can mean, how it's interpreted. And that's one of the problems, too. When people generally make arguments, they're not always very clear as to what they're making. Let's talk about like religion for a moment. If you were to ask somebody, do you believe in God? They might just answer yes, but their idea of God is completely different than, let's say, probably a mainstream United States Southern Baptist idea of God. Like somebody might call the universe God. Like a lot of the scientists would say, like, refer to God as the universe or something, and have no idea whatsoever. They have no understanding of this God being like a personal being, but they would still kind of refer to it as God, and then therefore there's a big misunderstanding. So you have to identify and argue the terms. You got to be very clear on what you're arguing about. And then once you're very clear on what you're talking about, say, okay, do you believe in, let's say, a personal God who's timeless, who's spaceless, who interferes in people's lives, blah, blah, blah. And you can go down the list of properties that this supposed God may have. And then somebody could either reject that or accept it. And once you have something clearly defined, then you're much better off developing an argument around that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So we go the same thing with the flat Earth, the climate change, or whatever. Climate change is another great example because people will say, like, do you believe in climate change? And that's so nebulous. I mean, what does that mean? Are we saying that the climate is changing? Well, of course it is. It's constantly changing. Are we saying it's getting warmer? Yeah, most people agree with that. So now is it human caused? And what can we do about it? There's so many issues, like sub issues, and it all gets rolled into one, which is unfortunate because it's difficult to argue that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, the issues get mixed, isn't it? And when we're trying to find truth, one of the things we have to do in our method is to separate the issues. People like some people are vegetarian or vegan for health reasons. They think, well, no, that's what my body requires, and that's one motivation, that's one issue. And then there are those that will think, well, I don't like cruelty to animals, and that's a separate issue. So there's two different issues, but they get mixed together, don't they? And just as with the climate change thing as well, we get everything sort of muddied up, and confusion abounds. Maybe you can take us into the sort of history of logical fallacies. When were they first identified, and when did the conversation first begin?
It goes back to Plato and Socrates, and you could read some of their writings and see some of the very basic fallacies presented there. And it begins with that whole Socrates is mortal, all men are mortal, therefore Socrates, or how does it go again? I always forget.
And therefore Socrates is mortal, yep.
Right. It's like the deductive reasoning, the logic behind that. And there are some informal, some very basic initial logical fallacies found there as well, all the way back in those times. And then you see a lot more in the 1800s come up with a lot of the writings of the philosophers at that time. And then more recently, it's had like a new explosion with the internet because there's so much discussion going on, and you can create fallacies basically by just naming them, attaching a name to a specific problem of reasoning that occurs on a regular basis. So,
can you give us an example?
Yeah. Well, there's nothing that definitely identifies like what a fallacy is, and that's one of the issues. If you ask somebody, what are the criteria for a logical fallacy? Again, it's very nebulous because there are some things that are cognitive biases, like the confirmation bias, when we really want to believe something, and a lot of these cognitive biases, they kind of flow over into the arguments, into logical fallacies. They kind of turn into logical fallacies. They're the foundation for a lot of logical fallacies. So you could think of a cognitive bias as kind of like the way we think, and the naturally occurring errors that happens because, again, we're not evolution didn't work with us to be extremely reasonable beings. We're very emotional beings as well, and the point of evolution is to survive and to procreate. And if our reasoning process doesn't help those two goals, then it's not going to be selected for, and it's not going to be important to our survival and our evolution. And that's what we see. So we see a lot of times that emotion takes over. And emotion is kind of the foundation of how we think and how we reason, and that's more important than logic because maybe it makes us feel better. It makes us happier. It prevents us from offing ourselves because we realize that life is pointless and there's nothing to it. So there's a lot of reasons that we could act fallaciously and reason fallaciously that really do help us.
So the appeal to emotion is, in fact, a logical fallacy, is it, or is it, or is there a whole bunch of them around that theme?
Oh, there's actually tons around appeal to emotion, and you could just basically take appeal to and then put any kind of emotion, appeal to anger, appeal to happiness, appeal to whatever. You can go down the whole list, and those again, that's a good example of something that may not have been defined by Plato or Socrates or Aristotle, but it is something that has evolved because it happens so often. So if you see a politician that gets up at the podium or the lectern and starts screaming, we got to do this because people are dying and people are getting hurt. And so they're really angry and they're really emotional. And that's basically the argument. We got to do it because I'm angry. So you need to dissect that, and you're going to say, okay, yeah, well, I feel like we need to do it because I get that feeling, I get that emotion. But if you reason it out and really think about it, then like at a rational level, it may be the wrong thing to do.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can just talk about emotions for a minute and then come back into the history, because it's fascinating, isn't it? A lot of people, the sort of, do you go with the head or do you go with the heart idea? And personally, I'm an objectivist fan of Ayn Rand's thinking, and I think there's a lot of credibility to her theory of emotions. As if we think of a cart and behind the horse sort of thing, it's thinking that comes first, and the emotions are dependent on that. And obviously, it's very easy to for people to just latch on to how they feel. But I'm very much of the persuasion that it's rational analysis which really gives us information of reality ultimately, and not the way you feel. I mean, we all know that you can't just eat donuts and cream puffs and drink Coca-Cola just because you feel like it. There are lots of people that would feel like eating junk food. But again, the facts of reality, as we know, dictate that our body has more specific requirements than eating just a load of sweets and sugar. So there's stacks of evidence that we can't act on our emotions, but they do remain a very powerful motivator for a lot of people, don't they?
Yeah, they sure do. And it's all about what the ultimate goal is. Like, are you trying to get to an ultimate truth? Are you trying to get to a fact of reality? Or are you simply going through life and making a decision that will make you happier? So that's an important consideration as well. A good example of this is like choosing a spouse or choosing a life partner. The way that most of us do it is you fall in love, right? you say, wow, I feel really good around this person. I'm happy around this person. This is the right person for me. And that's fine. That's wonderful if that leads to a life of happiness. Most of us don't take out a spreadsheet and give a point system to all the person's qualities and negatives. I mean, first of all, that'd be offensive to your partner, but it's not. We're not trying. In that case, we're not trying to get to a truth of reality, unless we say the truth of reality is this person is the right person for me. We're kind of messing with language there, because we're saying the truth of reality, and then we're trying to attach that to a subjective state, to a feeling of emotion. And that's where it gets a little bit dicey. Yeah.
Again, it's context specific, isn't it? Because if you're trying to decide, what flavor ice cream to have, or what film to watch in the evening, or
right,
where to go on Sunday, then it's perfectly legitimate to say, well, I feel like going hiking on Sunday, so I'll do that.
Right. There's no appeal to emotion there.
No, absolutely.
There's no fallacious reasoning in that process.
No, and again, it involves preference rather than facts of reality, doesn't it? As you mentioned earlier on. Perhaps we can just pick up the historical thread again then for a moment, because is it true that the concept and the discussion around logical fallacies sort of seemed to sort of disappear a little bit throughout? Was it around the sort of Renaissance period, and did it sort of become more? You mentioned already that it has become more popular due to the internet very recently, but how has the popularity of it done? Sort of previous couple of centuries.
Well, I guess first I would want to qualify this by saying I'm not a historian when it comes to this.
Fair play,
so I don't know a lot about it, but I would say, just from my understanding in building this book and collecting the fallacies and doing the research, the writings available on this topic, if you put this on a bar graph, you'll see a lot from like the original philosophers, like way back when, and then like a big dip in the material until like the 1800s, 1700s, 1800s, where it kind of gets a lot higher again, and then kind of another dip, and then once we approach the internet, in like the 90s, then like a huge skyrocket again with writings and books containing discussions about logical fallacies.
All right.
So I don't know if that is a good indicator of what was actually going on in I guess just in the discussions of this throughout the different cultures. But if it is, then that's probably what happened. Why, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of good news, I think, that interest in logical fallacies and the whole debate has gathered more momentum since the advent of the internet, because as you mentioned at the beginning, it's to do with accurate reasoning, isn't it? Which is really the essence of thinking.
Yes.
And if mankind, humanity are to solve our problems, we need to be able to think accurately. We need access to truth. We need to find exactly what the facts of reality are. And it seems very, very important that we identify any way in which we could accidentally pursue the wrong idea or be misled to pursue the wrong idea. So it seems very good news that logical fallacies are popular again. And obviously, from a point of view of book sales for you, it's not too bad either.
Right.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you a little bit more about truth and reasoning. Right. Where do you stand on reasoning? Can you tell us a little bit more about that with respect to logical fallacies?
Sure. Yeah. If I were to die tomorrow, I'd want something along the lines on my gravestone about that he was involved in critical thinking and reasoning. That's really kind of like the point of my adult life. Pretty much everything I do revolves around science, critical thinking, reasoning, rationality, and that thought process. I'm fascinated with all of the different topics surrounding that. And logical fallacies is just a segment of the entire critical thinking process. And what I always find very interesting, again, being in academia, I would think that it would be a fantastic idea to have courses on critical thinking. But it turns out, actually, that critical thinking is not easily taught, like as a course, like as a topic. The best way, and this is proven time and time again, to teach critical thinking, to teach rationality and reasoning, good reasoning, is to work this into everything that is being taught, every course that is being taught. And talk about fallacies, talk about reasoning process, question things. I mean, there are a lot of different techniques, but that's the way to do it. So to academics, I would strongly urge them to look at their content, look at their course material, their content, and try to work that in to get people to be better thinkers and not just accept things that are being taught, but question them and think about, like metacognition, think about how you think and why you think a certain way.
Yeah.
And that's really the key there.
It's interesting to note that thinking and reasoning aren't taught at all in school. It struck me. I mean, I'm passionate about reason and thinking as well, and it's there's a yawning great gap in the curriculum. Nobody tells you about reasoning. Logical fallacies obviously nowhere on the average school syllabus.
Right.
I think most people in this country, particularly in the UK, leave school without knowing what a logical fallacy is, more than likely. So it's a shame that we don't have any education on thinking. Would you, in your opinion, would you say that there's a place for some kind of specific topic in there, or is it just a method of teaching all of the other topics?
I would think so. Even though, again, the research has shown time and time again the best way to learn critical thinking is to include it in topics that people are already learning. I think there's a way to develop such a course that you can teach the basics. And in fact, I mean, I have courses on logical fallacies. I have courses on cognitive biases. These are all like online courses that I teach and people go through. So clearly it can be done. I mean, it's information that can be learned. But the question is, and one of the challenges is that people don't make an effort to learn things that they don't know they need to learn, or they don't have the motivation. Like, why should I learn this? They just don't get it, so they don't care. They don't have the motivation. But when you teach it within a topic that people are already motivated to learn, let's say like they're going to school for finance and they want to be an accountant or be a lawyer or something, then you work these critical thinking and reasoning processes into that course. they're now relating and associating the thing that they love, the topic that they love, with these ideas, and they're seeing how these ideas of reasoning and critical thinking could make them better at what they're studying and at what they plan to do professionally. So that's where it gets really powerful. But if you are the type of person, the type of self-learner who can say, yes, I know I need this information, I could see how this is important in my life, then you have that motivation, and the courses and the information specifically on critical thinking, logical fallacies, cognitive biases, whatever, will be very valuable to you.
How much do you think philosophy comes into it? Because it seems to me that, if we're to arrive at certainty and truth, and using these logical fallacies or awareness of them as a means to discovering the facts of reality, there are certain philosophical convictions that can either motivate thinking and reasoning and finding out truth, or completely undermine it. For example,
Right.
if you're a determinist and you thought, well, everything's fated to happen, what's the point? Or if you're, the whole sort of subjectivism and this whole idea of, if you create your own reality, if you create your life, you create reality, then there's no such thing as truth. Because if you decide something's true because you feel it, because you think it, because you believe it, and I decide something else is true, there's nowhere you can meet, is there? There's no sort of ultimate arbiter, if you like,
Right.
to say this is true or not. So how much do you think philosophy pays into this, and do you reference any philosophical ideas within any of your courses?
Yeah, I believe I do. Philosophy does play a large part in this, obviously, for the reasons that you suggest, but it's interdisciplinary, essentially. Reasoning, critical thinking, logical fallacies. It's not just philosophy. Psychology does play a large role in there, and this is the, I guess, what my contribution to logical fallacies has been. Most people who write or talk about logical fallacies in the past do so specifically from a philosophical perspective. Again, which is good, but it doesn't really give us a full picture of logical fallacies and the reasons behind them. Like why do we act this way? Why do we say things? Why do we reason this way? What's going on here? So that's what I try to add to the discussion of logical fallacies. In terms of your question about basically accepting truth, like I said, if somebody's like a determinist in a way that everything's going to happen no matter what we do. Actually, would that be more of a fatalist? I'm not sure.
Yes.
So it's like, the issues with that goes way beyond logical fallacies. To somebody just sitting on their couch and doing nothing, because whatever going to happen is going to happen, right? if they're of that mindset. But generally speaking, again, we can all agree on some aspect of reality. That again, with probably like 99% certainty or accuracy, we could say, all right, I am holding a pen in my hand, or I'm holding a pencil, or something along those lines, and we would most likely all agree. You would have like the occasional outlier who would say, well, are you actually holding it? Is it actually touching if you look at the molecules? Or is it actually a pen? Or is it more of a pencil? Because you could go on with that kind of reasoning, and you can get into absurdity, and it's just annoying for the most part.
That's going nowhere,
isn't it?
There's
always going to be people like that, discussions like that, and that's never going to stop. But what is important, generally speaking, you can just most people are on the same plane, like 99%, if I were to give a rough number, where you could say, yes, this is a straw man fallacy. What you are saying, you are completely mischaracterizing my argument to an argument that you could easily take down. And then everybody who's watching, most people would say, yes, that's clearly what's going on. So you have agreement. You don't have 100% agreement, but you could use fallacies to prove people like what they're doing is wrong, and they need to change their argument. And it works. For the most part, it really does work. although not with everyone in every situation.
Sure. So psychology, as you've alluded to, is a key component, isn't it? And of course, people's psychology varies as much as people's appearance, doesn't it? Really, it's a very, very varied thing. And obviously, well, not obviously, but do you think this sort of predisposes some people to either spot logical fallacies or be more susceptible to being fooled by them? How do you think?
Certainly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Their personality type is well known. People have all different types of personality, and some people are certainly what we would call just more gullible, more influential. Some people think more creatively and less logically. So there are a lot of different personality types and personality factors and traits that make it a lot easier for some people to spot fallacies, and a lot more difficult for others. So there is that part to it, and that's kind of like the biology of logical fallacies. It's the genetics, if you want to call it that, and how we respond to fallacies.
Yeah. So would you say then, Bo, that logical fallacies or an education in them and an awareness of them, would you say that's a very, very important part, or just an important part of people's general education, or is it sort of a niche interest? I think that this is very, very important. But some people might think, well, that's if you're a philosopher and you're armchair philosophizing about things, right. It may be of interest. I'm trying to sort of sell the idea, I suppose, that hey, everybody, you need to know about these things. What's your view on that?
Yes, I do think that logical fallacies is a very important part of reasoning and critical thinking in general. And reasoning and critical thinking is extremely important in everyday life for everybody, in virtually every situation, at least in the developed world. Logical fallacies, really, if you have, on my website, I have a list of like the 25 top fallacies that it is just kind of like an arbitrary list that I put together based on just my experience in dealing with this. If you know like the top 25 and you have a good understanding of these fallacies, you are better off than 95% of the rest of the population. You don't need to be a master in logical fallacies and know everything about everyone or be able to spot everyone. Once you basically educate yourself to the foundation of logical fallacies, the problem with the reasoning and how they happen, and you have a good understanding of, again, like a couple dozen, then other logical fallacies that you don't have a name for or you don't actually know are much easier to spot. And what happens in your thought process is you say, you know what, that sounds good, but something's definitely wrong there. Yeah. I want to accept it. I feel like I want to say, yeah, that makes sense. I believe that now. But there's something with what you said and how you said it that doesn't sit right with me. It like raised a red flag. And when you get to that point, that's a fantastic point, because now you're starting to recognize fallacious reasoning. And once you recognize that, you could then look into it and say, okay, this happened, this person said that. You could do some Googling, and then you could find the actual fallacy and why it's fallacious. Yeah. And that's how you increase your learning. Like every time something like that hits you and something doesn't seem right, then just Google it, do a little research, and then you're just making yourself more and more educated on this as time goes.
Yeah. That's a wonderful point, and I want to reiterate it because I think it's so important, because it correlates with my experience, is that you don't need to be anything approaching an expert on logical fallacies to gain enormous value from them. As you said, just knowing a few, becoming aware of the concept of logical fallacies, and studying up on a few examples is a great head start, isn't it? As you said, you're 95% ahead of everybody else. Excellent. So look, if any listeners are interested in logical fallacies, the website, I believe, is logicallyfallacious.com to check out your book there, Bo. Any other means of contacting you if anybody was interested in the other courses that you mentioned? You want to just let any viewers and listeners know how they might contact you, or any other things that you can offer?
Sure, yeah. I'm actually working on redeveloping my both my business and my personal website this year. That's kind of for my New Year's resolution to get all this done the first couple weeks, at least the first month of the year. But you could go to bobennett.com. I think that's probably the best place to find out more about me, and all of my things that I've done, the books that I've written, and the courses that I teach are all linked there. They're online courses. You can take them online. Many of them are free. I just like putting it out there just to educate the public. I enjoy doing it. So I hope people enjoy taking it.
Wonderful. Well, Bo, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. A fascinating and very informative discussion. And thank you all very much for listening. I do hope you get some value from this. I think it's very important that we do brush up on our reasoning skills and spot these fallacies in arguments in all walks of life. There are so many issues we've mentioned, the climate change debate, whether or not you vaccinate or all these sorts of things. It's very important if you're trying to make a decision, an important life decision. It's very important to spot, where you might have a fallacious argument. You might be inclined to believe something that isn't actually true. Thank you very much for listening. I do urge you to visit the website, lawfulrebel.com, and there's lots more there on finding truth and examining important issues to help you in big decisions with your life. And do join us again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.